Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and I'm here with Ayavadda. And this evening we'll be answering questions. The weekly monk chat opportunity to ask any questions whatsoever, as long as they're somewhat related to Buddhism, we'll do our best to answer. So you can type in questions at any time. And after we pay homage to the Buddha, then we'll start going through the questions. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami.
Okay, so it looks like we have a question from Victoria. Victoria says, "Good evening, Venerables. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha talks about the 4 kinds of people in the world. He mentions that practicing for the welfare of others includes encouraging people to abstain from alcohol. Does this mean that we should be advising our loved ones to stop drinking if we want to be good practitioners? I haven't had alcohol in over 2 years, but I don't want to seem preachy about it. Thank you."
Well, so I think it depends on the circumstances, and there's also a way of being encouraging without being preachy. Actually, just being present at occasions where maybe other people are drinking and they say, "Oh, Victoria, would you like a glass of wine?" And you can just say, "Oh, that's very kind of you, but no thank you, I don't drink alcohol. Actually, I stopped drinking 2 years ago and it's been great." And that actually is a way of encouraging other people to abstain from alcohol. You don't necessarily need to be like, "You evil person, you are destroying yourself and your entire family and the entire world and you're going to hell." Like, I mean, that actually might be appropriate depending on the circumstances, but generally speaking, that's not going to be very effective. But just modeling abstention from alcohol is already a way of encouraging other people. And actually, you can even say, like, if people say, like, "Oh, well, why don't you drink?" You can say, "Because it's part of my spiritual practice. It helps to support clarity of mind. It helps to support self-restraint. It helps to support contentment and serenity." You can talk about the benefits of not drinking alcohol, but all just as a description of your own practice and why you like to practice in that way because it's beneficial for you. And that is a way of encouraging other people without being preachy. Okay?
Okay. We have hello from some others. So John, Lydia, Maria, Kristen, Karuna, Norma, Geeta, and Sud. Hello, as well as Arun. And John asks, okay, I forgot. Yes. So John asks, why do some people hate shyness so much? I've heard someone say it's underconfidence and confusion. I think it could be fear. What do you think?
I think this doesn't really have anything to do with Buddhism. Like, shyness is a social concept. Like, well, who cares? Some people like to talk and others don't. Who cares? What's the big deal? Why do we have social expectations that some people should be talkative? Or social expectations that people should be more or less talkative? These are social constructs. They don't have anything whatsoever to do with morality or wisdom. So maybe some people just don't like to talk very much. Maybe they just don't want to engage in useless speech. And other people perceive that as shyness. So it's important not to, first off, not to believe that our cultural conditioning is somehow fundamentally, ultimately, absolutely true. rather recognizing cultural conditioning as arbitrary. Most of it is completely arbitrary. And second, it's important not to assume too much about other people. So maybe somebody else doesn't talk very much. Well, it would be a big assumption to say it's the result of underconfidence, confusion, and fear. There's a million other possible reasons. Maybe you could ask them why they don't like to talk very much, or why they don't talk very much. And maybe you might even find out that they actually do have some interesting things to say. Or maybe you'll actually find out that they just don't want to answer even that, and that's also okay. So then that leads you then to question your own assumptions. Why do you think this person is shy? What assumptions are you making about this person? Those are a few thoughts. Do you have anything on the topic?
No, I mean, I definitely agree with Bante about, I think also not speculating is helpful, yeah. And John also asks, why do intelligent people often have strong mental challenges? Is intelligence related innately to anxiety, for instance? Oops, I forgot to click that.
Well, right now at the monastery we have a rescue cat that we're fostering for a period of time. She has a lot of anxiety and very little intelligence. So I would say intelligence is not innately related to anxiety. In fact, if we take this particular cat as an example, we would see an inverse correlation. So I don't think so. I've met some very low intelligence people who seemed to view life as a relaxing walk in the park. Everything's easy, no trouble. And I've also met some very intelligent people who, had constant struggles, who saw life as this constant, overwhelming challenge, and vice versa. I've met low intelligence people who clearly see life as a constant struggle, and high intelligence people who see life as something easy and not difficult at all. So I haven't seen any correlation between intelligence and anxiety. Yeah, absolutely zero correlation. You have some thoughts?
I think that's good.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, what I was going to say is that maybe there's people who are less aware of their scenario, they might be less critical of it. People who are more aware, they might be more anxious or something, but it's not necessarily true of everyone. So
yeah, because actually a lack of understanding also causes anxiety.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, Mariah says that when she learns about Buddhist cosmology, it's difficult to accept all of the claims of devas and gods. Why do Buddhists not believe in the Abrahamic creator god, but believe in other gods?
Well, let's just replace the words devas and gods with, say, Russians and Nigerians. It's difficult for me to accept all the claims of the existence of Russians and Nigerians. Why do you believe in the... I'm assuming you believe in the existence of Russians and Nigerians. Why? Have you ever met any? Maybe you met people who claimed they were ones, but do you know for sure? Where do these beliefs come from? Have you ever actually been to Russia? Have you ever actually been to Nigeria? Or Argentina? Or Antarctica? I bet you believe in Antarctica, but you've probably never been there. You probably believe in penguins. Have you ever seen a penguin in real life?
I have.
You have? Great. I bet you believe in killer whales. Ever seen a killer whale in real life? Or a blue whale? Again, you probably believe in these things. Have you ever seen a microbe in real life? Do you actually believe in the existence of the Milky Way galaxy? Have you ever actually seen it? I'm willing to bet there's a lot of things that you believe in, and yet you don't have much actual direct sensorial proof of those things. And yet you believe in them because of inference, because of other facts and bits of information that you then put together and come to concluding that something is probably true. For example, I've never been to Russia or Nigeria or Argentina or Antarctica, but I'm pretty sure they exist. Because of other information I have, I can infer that these things are probably real. I've never seen a blue whale. I'm reasonably sure they exist. I've never seen plankton. I'm reasonably sure that exists too. Let's see. There's lots of things which I'm pretty sure are real, and yet I've never directly touched or seen or contacted with my own senses. And yet, through logical inference, we can think that it's quite likely that they exist. So it's the same. As one develops a deeper understanding of Buddhist thought, a deeper understanding of Buddhist concepts, then it becomes increasingly clear through logical inference that there are other kinds of beings which are not so easy for us to see with our eyes, not so easy for us to hear with our ears. And that includes things that we call things like devas and brahmas and ghosts and spirits of various sorts. We can infer the probable existence of these beings. That doesn't necessarily mean you can see and hear them, but you can infer that they probably exist. Okay? Do you have any thoughts you want to add on this?
Actually, yes, I do. Well, I think on the point of why do Buddhists not believe in the Abrahamic creator God but believe in other gods, what comes to mind for me with this is that so the idea of a creator God, specifically the Abrahamic creator God, so an eternal creator God, is an inherently metaphysical concept. And by metaphysical, I mean it's something that it has to be taken as a kind of view or belief or theory that is actually inherently unprovable. So it's inherently improvable. It's beyond the senses. It's beyond what can be known that there is a God which is eternal, right? Because you can't actually know something for eternity because the next moment it might cease. So you can know if something ceases because you can actually see, you can know that something has ceased, but you can't know that something is eternal. It's impossible. It's beyond the bounds of knowledge because knowledge itself is bound up with time. So in order to know that something is eternal, you would have to be eternally there knowing it. But how would you know that your knowing is eternal? So you can't. So the idea of a creator God, it's very different. So this is why Buddhists believe in other beings. The idea in Buddhism is that gods and other beings, although they may be very difficult to see, although many of us, we cannot see them or sense them, in theory it is actually possible to know and see them precisely as the Buddha declared them. In theory, it's impossible to know an Abrahamic creator God as it's precisely declared by people who believe in it. So the difference is that one thing can be accessed through sensorial information. It can be accessed through the senses, and it can be seen to the extent that the claims are made about it. So you can, just like you can use a microscope and you can see things like microbes that Bhante was mentioning, it doesn't require a metaphysical claim that microbes are, for example, eternal. But just the claim that microbes exist and that they have certain behaviors and that if you observe them closely, you can observe those behaviors, that is something that you actually can confirm. But if you had to build a microscope from scratch, it would be incredibly difficult. It took a long time for human civilization to build up microscopes and a lot of focused effort. Well, in our culture, we haven't spent that much effort building up the ways to enhance our mind sense. We've enhanced our other senses like vision and hearing through machinery, but enhancing the mind sense has not been done so much in our culture at this particular time. But in theory, it can be done, and in theory, all the claims can be confirmed. But that's not the case for eternal creator God, and so that's why the Buddha denied the idea of a God. It's the same idea of why do Buddhists not believe in a self? It's because the idea of a self is an inherently unconfirmable metaphysical concept which is not worth indulging in. It only creates attachment and confusion. Because you can't actually know something that's behind your experience eternally. It's just a meaningless way of speaking. It actually ends up being meaningless. It's just a way that we trip ourselves up in language. So that's why the idea of devas and gods being impermanent and having particular behaviors that can be observed is different from the theory or idea of a creator God. The creator concept is also addressed in the Four Noble Truths, and then when the Buddha explains why do we experience what we experience? Because of craving, which leads to continued existence. That's why we're here. And so that is something that, in theory, someone can observe, but you can't, in theory, observe being created by something. So there are other reasons, but just to touch on the creator concept as well, it's because these ideas are inherently unprovable, but other things can actually be observed, like cause and effect and like impermanence. Those actually can be seen.
Okay.
Okay, and Arun asks, How to handle separation from loved ones when they move on and you are seemingly lower in their priorities of relationships.
Be grateful. Be grateful that your life has become more peaceful. Okay, next question.
Okay. Sad.
Yeah, less entanglements, more peace. Sounds great. Okay, next.
Okay, John says that he recently had a meditation experience where he felt pleasurable feelings in the body, and it was as if he went into a clearing in a forest, and there were these few moments of calm and peace. Is this nirjana?
Probably not, but it sounds like it's going in the right general direction. So, increased sense of pleasure in the body, increased sense of calm and peace in the mind. Those are both good indications. Those are both good signs. Yep. So, is it near jhana? Probably not anywhere near. Is it going in the right direction? Could be. Yeah, sounds likely. Yep. Still a long ways to go, though, just based on what you're saying. Probably still quite a long way to go. Okay, next.
And Sud asks, how can one develop mindfulness while engaged in activities?
You can answer this one.
Okay, well, how to engage? Well, the Buddha's instruction for this is, he actually says that one is a sampajanakari hoti. So one is someone who has situational awareness, is sometimes is translated. It's a little bit okay, but another way it's translated is clear comprehension. So this is really the word that the Buddha uses mostly for mindfulness in everyday scenarios. And it combines with sati, but the Buddha's instructions specifically are that when you're going about the day, so it's given to monks. So like, for example, when putting on the robe and going for alms, but this could be like when putting on your suit and going to work. So when you are getting dressed, when you're walking, when you're extending your limbs, so this would be things like picking up glasses and setting them down or moving objects. When you are in the different postures, so when you switch from standing to sitting or sitting to standing to walking or walking to running or anything like that, the Buddha's instruction is to clearly know what is happening in that scenario. So clear awareness of your bodily posture, clear awareness of what you're doing. And also then we can extend this to the other instruction generally about clear awareness of the mind. So clear awareness of, for example, when you're doing something, what is your motivation? Is it motivated by greed or is it motivated by non-greed, generosity? Hatred or kindness, confusion or clarity? And so generally speaking, the basic way to start is just when you're doing something, do you know what it's like to be aware of that? So do you know what it's like, for example, to be mindful of breathing? And if you know what it's like to be aware of an activity that's happening in the present, you just extend that awareness to what you're doing. And then maybe in terms of tips, because hopefully that's pretty clear. I don't know how to describe it other than be aware in detail of what that would be like in the mind. But tips for how to do it, I think that what I said about the posture junctions, I think that's a good way. That is actually taught in a way by the Buddha. So he teaches specifically in the different postures to be clearly aware. So for example, can you just be clearly aware right now that you're seated? So even though I'm speaking, I can also be aware at the same time that my body is seated. And then when you change postures, you can always be aware, oh, now I'm changing to a different posture, and then be aware of the next posture. So whatever you're doing, you can have this general awareness of the posture. Even if you can't be very precisely, clearly aware of every single movement or every single thought, you can have a general background awareness, just aware that, okay, my body is seated, standing, walking, or lying down. And once you build up that ability throughout the day of just general awareness grounded in the posture, then you can start extending that out to, for example, more fine movements. So like even when you're in a general posture, are you aware of every miniature movement that you make? Are you aware of the specific movements of the mouth, what you speak, and so on? Those types of things can also be done if you want to start enhancing your mind being grounded in the present. But you can start just like in the posture, and then when you switch postures, use that as a reminder. So like when we finish this and I go to stand up, if I'm not mindful of that posture change, then maybe you'll remember, oh, I forgot. I changed postures, and how did I get here? Like last time I was aware I was sitting, and now I'm standing. So then you can remember, oh, next time I need to be aware when I change over. And then at least if you lose your mindfulness, then when you change postures throughout the day, at least you maybe have a little juncture there. So that's one idea.
Sadhu. Okay, next.
And Manny says, Bhante, by giving metta to difficult people, can we expect them to change for the better? If not, what is the point of this practice? Thanks.
No, you cannot expect them to change. So metta is not about changing other people, it's about changing yourself. So, and technically speaking, it's impossible to give metta to other people, although people do talk in this way. What it actually means is cultivating the attitude of metta regarding other people. You can't actually give anything to anybody else, in the sense of, like, you can't, like, take a chunk of metta from your heart and, like, give it to somebody else. It doesn't work that way. What you do is you cultivate metta within your own heart. And you cultivate metta regarding all beings, towards all beings, in relationship to all beings. So the point of doing metta is to purify your own heart. It's to cultivate a wholesome mind state within your own mind. It's to reduce the defilements in your own mind. It's to develop the conditions for samadhi, for jhana, within your own mind. It's to help you progress towards awakening through clearing away the obstacles to awakening. That's its purpose. And the point of so-called giving metta to difficult people is because, generally speaking, if you regard somebody as difficult, what that actually means is that you have some aversion and hostility towards that person. So the point of metta is not about making that person change their behavior, but rather it's about removing the hostility from your own heart. Whether the other person changes or not is their choice to make. Your choice is to stop hating them. And that's why you give metta to them, as people say. Okay? Good.
And I think Bhante has a video recently about the benefits of metta, so you can also look at that.
Yeah, it was just yesterday, I think. Okay, next.
Okay, so Joe says, he asks here, he says, I'm studying the social neuroscience of Dr. Tanya Singer and the Tibetan monk Matthew Ricard. They're studying the difference between compassion and empathy. Their research shows that developing mindfulness doesn't develop compassion, and developing both mindfulness and compassion, I assume, doesn't develop perspective. How does one develop this third part? Perspective is known as the theory of mind and being able to understand another person's perspective. Apparently, psychopaths have strong perspective taking, but no compassion, for example.
I don't understand. I don't get. Do you understand what he's talking about here? I'm not getting this at all.
I don't know if I do. I don't understand how developing compassion doesn't develop perspective. I don't know if I understand. I don't think I understand the difference between the two so well. I mean, I guess perspective is maybe empathy, like understanding the other person's. But it seems like to have compassion, you would need to have perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I understand the difference.
Yeah, because compassion is rooted in the recognition of the suffering of others.
Yeah.
So that necessarily means some understanding of other people's experience, at least in a theoretical sense. Yeah, I don't understand how they're using these terms. So I would need to see how they're defining the terms that they're using here. So what were the terms? So mindfulness, compassion, and perspective. I would need to see how they're defining these words.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's impossible to answer.
Yeah, maybe Joe, if you read it a little bit more, like with a little bit more clarity of definition, we could look. He also has it. Looks like it continues here.
This looks like it's unrelated, though.
Okay, this is 4:3, but I know. Okay. So then our next question is from Brittany. It looks like. What is a healthy ratio of listening to Dhamma and meditation and reflection? Says that they read in stillness flowing by Ajahn Jayasaro, one might become intoxicated by Dhamma and neglect their own practice. Asking due to limited time in lay life. Thanks.
Well, I have no idea what Ajahn Jayasaro meant by that, because it doesn't sound remotely like anything I've seen anywhere in the suttas. So I can't think of anywhere in the suttas where the Buddha said it's dangerous to listen to the Dhamma because you might become intoxicated and forget to practice. In fact, he says basically the opposite everywhere. That it's actually extraordinarily important to listen to the Dhamma and pay attention to the Dhamma and focus your mind on the meaning of the Dhamma, and to do so that you can practice in accordance with Dhamma. So I don't understand what Ajahn Jayasaro meant by that statement, so I cannot explain or defend it or attack it because I just don't know what he's talking about. But yeah, I would say that when interacting with any Dhamma teaching, well, first off, you should start by reading all the suttas cover to cover, at least once, preferably twice, preferably more than that, so that you have some basis for comparison. But then when listening to any Dhamma, then you're first asking, does this line up with what's in the suttas? If the answer is no, then you reject it. If the answer is yes, then you look how it relates to what you've learned from the suttas. And when listening to any Dhamma thing, you should also be asking, how can I apply this to my life? How can I use this as a tool of self-reflection and self-development? Because that's the purpose of learning Dhamma. The purpose of learning Dhamma is to understand the obstacles to awakening within our own heart and how to overcome and eliminate those obstacles in our heart. Okay?
Okay. And this person asks, how far can taking seriously the 5 precepts for lay people take them toward enlightenment?
Do you want to talk a bit about this?
Sure. So you say this might be a silly question. I don't think it's silly, but I would urge you not to have too much of a utilitarian mindset towards these things. It's useful to understand, because we need to understand. But I would say part of the question of like how far might it bring someone towards enlightenment is almost irrelevant in a way. Of course it's not irrelevant, but it's almost to a point of we take the 5 precepts not because we just want to get what we want as soon as possible, but we take them to become better people and to let go. And that is actually the movement towards enlightenment. So how far can taking them seriously bring you? Well, I mean, if you really take them seriously, completely on, like, as deeply into your own person, then I would say that it would be a massive step towards enlightenment. In fact, the arahants are said to be the people who naturally don't break, for example, the 5 precepts. So who takes the 5 precepts the most seriously? It would be arahants. Because arahants are incapable of intentionally breaking the 5 precepts according to the suttas. So if you're not just completely incapable under any scenario whatsoever of breaking the 5 precepts, then you haven't actually taken them seriously enough. And if you are completely incapable, then you must be an arahant probably. So I would say that to that extent, then taking the 5 precepts would bring you all the way to enlightenment. Now, of course, those alone won't be enough. You have to do some other things too. But in terms of getting towards that goal, then taking them seriously, it kind of represents a commitment to letting go of our own preferences and ideas. And because why do we break the 5 precepts? Out of greed, hatred, and delusion. So if you take them semi-seriously, well, then you are committing to semi-greed, semi-hatred, semi-delusion. So you'll be semi-committed towards enlightenment. If you take them 1/3 of the time, well, then 1/3 of the time you'll be committed towards enlightenment, and 2/3 of the time you'll be committed towards greed, hatred, and confusion. So, like, to the extent that you take them seriously, that's the extent that you take enlightenment seriously, because enlightenment means not acting out of greed, hatred, and delusion. And there's way more that we do out of greed, hatred, and delusion than the 5 precepts. Those are incredibly low level, like greed, hatred, and delusion. So, yeah, it's definitely necessary. But the best way to take them is not taking them as, again, utilitarian rules, but rather taking them seriously means understanding the intention behind them and taking that seriously. So when presented with a choice of, for example, breaking a precept, what we shouldn't do is think, I won't do this thing. I'll continue keeping my precept, because purely by following this rule and this observance, then it's somehow making me get closer to enlightenment. It is actually better to do that, because at least you won't be doing bad karma, you won't be doing bad things. So it is actually better to do that. But the best way to take them seriously is to, when you're presented with a choice of breaking a precept or not, you reflect on the mind state that would be involved in restraining yourself or in acting out and breaking the precept. And when you reflect on that and the drawbacks of it, and you see the benefits of keeping the precept for yourself and for others and for everyone, then because you take that principle so seriously, you don't break it. So you take it so seriously because you care so deeply about not acting out of greed, hatred, and delusion, and not overstepping these clear boundaries of bad karma that were laid down by the Buddha. So taking them in that way would be a way of training the mind with them, and a way of letting go, learning, like a process of education, of seeing when you're about to do something, why you would do it, and evaluating which one will lead to more suffering for yourself and others, and which one leads to more freedom from suffering. So that is a very serious way of taking the precepts, rather than just blindly following them. Both is better than not following them. But taking them seriously in terms of your mind training can take you very far.
Okay, good.
And Joe asked about, does this remind you of training in Theravada? I think in relation to what you were saying before. An example is how the Buddha could take the shape of his audience, speaking to warriors in the language of warrior, or speaking to Brahmins as Brahmins.
And that's just, the Buddha would speak in a way that people could understand him. So like if he was speaking to people in France, he would speak in French. Like if he's like in Germany, he would speak in German. Like that's just his skill as a communicator. Again, I don't see what it has to do with this whole like concept of compassion and perspective, because I still don't understand what the heck these scientists mean by the word perspective. I have no perspective on that. Okay, well, keep going.
Okay, it looks like he has this other question. Is the next one. It looks related. Does the Pali Canon have any practices or training to develop theory of mind and understanding the perspectives of others?
Well, you need to define these terms. So when you come in using non-Buddhist terms, I just have no idea what you're talking about. So if you use Buddhist terms, then I'll understand. If you use like non-Buddhist terms, then you need to define them. So these are technical terms from somebody else's system of thought. Therefore, I don't know what these technical terms mean. What is theory of mind? I have no idea. These terms need to be clearly defined before we can talk about them. Okay, next.
Okay. And Kristen says she keeps dozing off, or they keep dozing off during sitting meditation, even in early morning sit after sufficient sleep. We're practicing open awareness meditation with open eyes, staying aware of what the mind is doing, what the body is feeling. As soon as the mind isn't as busy, they can feel themselves dozing off. It's almost like someone is closing eyes. Say, aware not to try staying awake too hard, nor let the body slip into this comfortable lull.
Well, actually, if you're saying you're trying not to stay awake, that might exactly be the problem right there. Maybe you should actually try a bit harder to stay awake. So if you're falling asleep during meditation and it's not related to actual physical tiredness, there's a few things that can be causing this. The most likely thing is that you're just not interested in the meditation practice that you're doing. That is the number one reason why people doze off during meditation. Boredom. Disinterest in their meditation method. So depending upon the particular individual, disinterest in your meditation method will take the form either of dullness, dozing off, or it takes the form of agitation, restless thinking. So trying to find some mental activity, generate mental activity that will interest you. So usually the best option is to switch to a meditation practice that you're actually interested in. Fortunately, in the world of Buddhism, there are dozens and dozens of meditation methods in Theravada Buddhism alone. And then each of those methods, there's usually several different ways of practicing them. several different ways of applying them. So you have literally hundreds of ways to meditate, and apparently whatever you're currently doing is not interesting enough to hold your attention. So stop doing that. Do something else. Do something that's more interesting. And yes, absolutely, you should be trying hard to stay awake. Of course you're falling asleep. Okay, next.
Okay. And Neil asks, it is said that all that is impermanent is suffering, but what about painful feeling? Isn't it a blessing that painful feeling is impermanent?
Well, actually, the Buddha does say that painful feeling is pleasant when it's changing. So the problem, of course, is that when the mind is not pure and wise, then whatever sensation arises, one will relate to it again with either desire or aversion. So why is the changing of a painful sensation perceived as pleasant? It's because of aversion towards the current sensation and desire for another one. So that desire and aversion is in fact dukkha. So this is the actual problem here. It's not actually the sensation itself, but rather it's the desire and aversion in relation to that sensation. Okay?
And
unless you had something else to add to that.
I mean, but I was going to just say that there's also one thing to keep in mind is that the Buddha, there's different levels to dukkha as well. So one is the dukkha, the pain of dukkha itself, like the uncomfortableness of pain. So dukkha. This is on the level of painful feeling. But when the Buddha is talking about impermanence, he's talking about a different level, you could say, of what we call dukkha. So that's what I was going to say, but I don't know if it's worth it.
It's more the unsatisfactoriness of the unreliability of all things. That nothing whatsoever can be relied upon as stable. Because actually, even if pain was absolutely permanently unchanging, then eventually you would just become habituated to it. You'd become used to it. And then it would actually become an anchor that you could rely upon. So your relationship with it would shift to the point where it became something that was actually pleasant because it was a stable anchor. So the problem of impermanence is that it means that there's absolutely no stable anchor anywhere in reality. There's nothing whatsoever that can be relied upon. And that creates suffering because we are constantly seeking something to rely upon, something that we can depend upon, and there isn't anything anywhere. So this is why impermanence is suffering. It's because we are seeking a reliable anchor, and there is none to be found. Okay, next.
And Mariah says, can you please explain what makes a type of meditation Buddhist versus non-Buddhist? Not necessarily addressing all the different methods, just in general.
Well, I would say it's Buddhist if it's cultivating the factors of awakening, and it's non-Buddhist if it is not cultivating the factors of awakening, or even worse, if it's cultivating the opposite. If we want to be a bit more precise, Buddhist meditation, what makes a meditation uniquely Buddhist is the perception of non-self. So perceiving all things as anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal. That is uniquely Buddhist. Nothing else, no other spiritual system besides Buddhism does that. Some come close, but none actually go all the way outside the domain of Buddhism. And if they did, then we would just call them Buddhism. And in fact, they would be Buddhism if they were actually doing these three practices. And then we have a number of auxiliary practices which are designed to support cultivating the recognition of anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and impersonality. So to support that, we have a bunch of practices like mindfulness and concentration and loving kindness and compassion and equanimity and so on. Those are all things that support this direct perception of the true nature of reality, namely that all things are impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal. So that's what makes meditation Buddhist versus non-Buddhist. Okay?
And Sud, is there a way to combine metta with mindfulness, or are those two practices completely different?
Well, when you have metta, be mindful of your metta. So they necessarily they go together. You need to be constantly mindful of your metta, which is an aspect of mindfulness of mind, and therefore part of satipatthana practice. Okay, next.
Okay. This isn't really a question.
No, those aren't questions.
So currently we are at the end of the questions.
Okay, so that's the last question. So if no other questions appear momentarily, you have a question?
Sorry. I have a question of some things that come up in the suttas. I've been reading some suttas about Mara, and sometimes I've been noticing that I'm reading when I hear these different stories of Mara going into people's bellies and things like that, and I get really afraid.
Then do lots of metta.
Okay, so metta can help with the fear.
Yeah, do lots of metta and the recollection of the Buddha. Recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha is what the Buddha recommended for fear. Also, if you recall, one of the benefits of metta is that you will not be attacked by non-human beings. So do a lot of metta. And also it says the devas protect you if you do a lot of metta. So do a lot of metta and practice recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And also, whenever you're sharing merit, remember to share merit with Mara. He needs it too. In fact, he needs a lot of it because he's making a lot of bad karma. So share merit with Mara. Poor buddy. I have a lot of compassion for Mara. He thinks he's king of the world, but actually he's just making giant piles of bad karma all the time. It's really sad. Poor little buddy. Have compassion for Mara. Okay? And we have a couple more questions here.
Yeah, Lydia just asked, what is the question?
Someone was just talking about when reading suttas which reference Mara and people being attacked by Mara, that this person is feeling fear. So they were asking what to do about that.
Okay, so Juliana says, what are your thoughts on a reliable way to incorporate Buddhist practices, meditation, reading suttas, etc. for busy lay people? I am a student and I struggle.
Yeah, well, first off, just look at all the things you do with your day. And I'm willing to bet that you actually have lots of time in your day. You just spend it doing silly things like watching entertainment, watching shows and movies, spending time chatting with people about silly and useless things, reading pointless books that have nothing to do with Buddhism, which is basically anything that doesn't relate to Buddhism is kind of inherently pointless. So if you actually look at your day, you'll realize you have tons of time. You just spend it doing worthless things. So start carving away chunks of that time to do useful things. So no matter how busy your day is, you probably have time to do, for example, 10 minutes of chanting, 15 minutes of sutta study, and 30 minutes of meditation. That's about 1 hour. You can even divide it up throughout your day if you wish to. But you can find the time. There's somebody I know who's working 2 jobs, full-time, both full-time jobs. They're working 7 days a week, 80 plus hours a week, and yet every day they do an hour of chanting. And you might think, how is that possible? How do they have time? And they have time because they choose to have time. So it's not that you don't have time, it's just that you're choosing to use your time for other things. So choose to use your time to do Buddhist things, and then suddenly you'll find that you actually have all the time in the world. It just means doing a bit of renunciation. So it's like, well, I could spend 30 minutes watching reruns of the Kardashians, or I could spend 30 minutes reading suttas and doing meditation. It's a choice. You choose. So you have to practice a bit of renunciation, choosing to let go of your attachment to worthless time-wasting activities, which letting go is also inherently a Buddhist activity. So letting go of your desire and attachment to do useless things in order to cultivate actually beneficial things, namely chanting, meditation, and sutta study, that's also Buddhist practice. Renunciation of your desire and attachment for useless things. So look at your life and start deliberately letting go of useless things in order to make time to do Buddhist activities. Okay. See if there's any other questions.
There was some others here. So Sud says, why is it that Paritta chanting is protective? Is there an early Buddhist explanation regarding this?
Do you want to answer that?
Sure. So, while there are some places in the suttas, relatively rarely. So, for example, one is the Kanda Paritta. It's a chant done for protection from things like snakes and dangerous animals. So that is in the suttas. And there's also one, the Atta Anatya Sutta. It's a sutta about protection, specifically talking about devas protecting Buddhists and so on. So there are a few discourses. Generally speaking, what people think of as Paritta chanting, it's not found in the suttas. And the suttas it is found in, to be really frank, are a little bit questionable. No, it's not questionable. I mean, so for example, the Attanatya Sutta, it's, if I recall correctly, it's actually saying there's actually deities that go to the Buddha and they say that they want to protect Buddhists, essentially. And so they say like, oh, if they chant this, it's essentially the chant, at least part of it, is saying like to the spirits that may be bothering you. It's essentially a chant saying, hey, watch out, because these other gods said that they're Buddhist and they're gonna like beat you up if you bother me. So it's actually kind of like it's sort of like they wrote this like a slip that's like, just show this to people and they'll know that like you're friends with me, and so then they won't bother you. So it's a little bit different from a Paritta chant in the way we think of it. It's not really like a magical. The chant itself is more like, yeah, I know these people in the government, so you might want to be careful. That's kind of the equivalent of that one. And then the Kanda Paritta is also, it's actually a metta chant. So it's actually saying like to the different snake families, saying like you have metta for them. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of saying like, oh, I have metta for you. And it says like, please don't harm me, essentially, like may there not be harm. And so it's a little bit, again, it's a little bit different. So it's not that the chant itself is per se like a series of words that are just in the syllables in themselves are protective, but rather the words themselves are saying like that you give metta to these different classes of beings, and so it's sort of more in that domain of metta. So even those that are in the suttas, they're more specific. So they're not just like, for example, a mantra and it's believed that the mantra is protective, but they're specific words that are meant to either mean something particularly that's protective, like the sort of pass from the spirits that they gave to the Buddha, or the metta chant. And so then in terms of other Paritta chanting, although in the Buddhist tradition it is said to be, there is chanting that's said to be Paritta, meaning protective, it is good to remember that the Buddha said that there is no purity through what is sutta. Sutta means what is heard. So at the time of the Buddha, there were people who believed, also to this day, people who believe that through hearing things, so through processing auditory information, that one can become pure. So for example, hearing sacred chanting, hearing particular words or phrases, that people believe that this is purifying. And the Buddha was very clear that there is not purity through what is heard, through information that we hear. So That's important to keep in mind because that is repeated many, many times. So if the way that we relate to chanting is by hearing this chanting, it's purifying me or something, the Buddha was very, very clear that idea is, while it's understandable, it's part of our psychology because we hear things and it makes us feel good. So we start associating in the mind purity with auditory information. But in fact, the Buddha was very clear that that's not the case. So I would say that Paritta chanting is something that's in the tradition, but it's not something that generally speaking, the Buddha talks about. And especially in the way that we might think like the words themselves are protective, that the Buddha is, it's more critical, more in the domain of the Buddha being critical than of condoning. So that's what I would say on that.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. And Lydia asks, are different beings, I assume, do different beings become Mara since Mara is impermanent? And does Mara get future lives in lower realms?
Yes. So there's a few suttas where the term Mara is used to refer not to a single being, but rather to a category of devas. So there's not one Mara. Actually, even right now, there's not one Mara. There's actually multiple Maras. But commonly when we use the word Mara as a proper name, we're talking about Lord Mara, like the chief of the Maras, the one who has the most power and influence and has an unfortunate habit of harassing Buddhists. That's the one we normally talk about. And what's interesting is that there's a few places in the suttas where various monks talk about their past lives and mention having been Mara in a past life. So I think Mahamoggallana specifically mentions having been Mara in a past life, for example. So you think, well, Mahamoggallana is this great arhat, this incredible Buddhist saint, this monk who completely purified his heart and became so incredible. And in a past life, he was Mara. So clearly being Mara is not a permanent state. It's something which is temporary, like any other. Yes, a Mara can be reborn in lower realms because, as I mentioned before, Maras tend to make a lot of bad karma by hassling us poor Buddhists, and that's really bad karma to hassle Buddhists. So they tend to wind up getting negative rebirths as a result. But that's also temporary, like everything else. Okay?
And then we have Yong Cho says, we usually do 45 minutes of meditation. During today's meditation, mind became entangled in pretty rough shape, I assume. This was unusual, so they decided to get up. Any suggestion to overcoming this?
Yeah, there's a few things you can do. One thing which can be remarkably effective is whenever you notice that you're getting really caught up in a bunch of entangling thought, stop whatever you're doing. Like, stay seated, but just stop whatever technique you're using or whatever, and just take a few long, slow, deep breaths. Just focusing on the feeling of the breath coming in and going out. The longer, slower, and deeper, the better. And usually after doing about 3 or 4 long, slow, deep breaths, you'll have already forgotten whatever you were doing with your mind a moment ago. And then you can go back to doing your meditation practice. So that's a pretty remarkable way of resetting the mind, is to just take a few long, slow, deep breaths and really focus on the feeling of the breath as you do it. Another thing is to switch to loving-kindness meditation. Again, just take your mind and put it somewhere else. Like, just switch to doing loving-kindness meditation. Really put your heart into it. Really put your non-soul into doing loving-kindness meditation with all your fervor and dedication that you can muster. That also tends to really cut through those mental entanglements. And it is okay to switch to standing meditation or walking meditation. So you don't need to always be in a sitting posture. And sometimes actually when the mind is really agitated, then switching to standing or walking meditation can be really useful. But what I do encourage is do not give up on the meditation until the time is up. So if you've resolved to do 45 minutes, then do 45 minutes. Maybe halfway through you switch to walking meditation. That's fine. Just do walking meditation. But keep going until the 45 minutes is up. Okay?
Okay. And Sood, so he's continuing, says, there is a calming effect of the Parittas. Is this not purifying? Why is it that it is so calming, or is it just mind getting tricked to becoming calm without being purified?
Well, Sood, look at your own mind. Look at your own mind and look to see why is it becoming calm when you listen to Parittas. Some people, they hear Buddhist chanting and they get really upset because they think the demon worshippers are at it again. Other people, they hear Paritta chanting and they just think, wow, that's some cacophonous noise. These people need to get singing lessons. Other people, they hear Paritta chanting and it just sounds like a bunch of meaningless nonsense. So why is it that you experience calm when you hear Paritta chanting? Have a look at that. I'm willing to bet that it has more to do with your faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha than it does with the actual words. In which case, what's bringing you that sense of calm and purity is your own faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Which means that Paritta is not what's purifying your heart. It's you that's purifying your own heart. And the Paritta is just serving as a reminder for you to purify your heart. In which case, it's serving its function. Okay?
Yeah. And Mariah says, sometimes they have days or a week at a time where the renunciation is going well, so the rest of the practice is too. But she struggles to maintain this state and eventually goes back to laziness or time-wasting habits. Any advice on maintaining periods of renunciation and diligence?
Well, one thing that works is just to remind yourself of the pleasure of renunciation and the painfulness of distraction and defilement. And then the mind will naturally incline back towards renunciation. Yeah. Also creating external supports. So going on retreats, going on camping or hiking trips in the wilderness, spending time at monasteries. So those are external supports for renunciation that are all very useful. But yeah, really focus on the happiness and serenity and clarity that comes when you're practicing well. Remind yourself of that. And focus on the agitation and misery that comes when you're not practicing well. So that then the mind is less inclined to go into that state. Okay, next.
Okay, and Juliana says, how to deal with feelings of unhealthy attachments to friends? How do you care for them without feeling upset if you do not spend as much time with them as you wish?
Oh, I love being alone, actually. So what I recommend is to cultivate the joy of solitude. So the solution is to just stop wanting to spend time with other people. What is time with other people? It's just agitation and disturbance, that's all. What is time alone? Time alone is serenity and peace. So focus on the serenity and peace that comes from time alone versus the agitation and disturbance that comes from time with other people. Okay?
Yeah. And Victoria asks, does the Buddha go into much detail about his past lives? If so, can you recommend any places to read about them in the suttas?
You can answer this one.
Well, I believe Ayasoma recently did a sutta study on one, so I would look at that. He talks a little bit about how he recollected, he experienced the good karma for a long, long time, and so he talks about how he recollected those lives and how he investigated what causes he had put in order to experience those results. So that's in the Itivuttaka. I believe it's 22 or something, 21, but you can check the video recently from Ayasoma. Talks about that. Other times he talks about his... he talks generally about, if you just look at the suttas where the Buddha gives his own, he gives a little bit of his biography. So a good place to look would be the Majjhima Nikaya number 26. That's a classic sutta on the Buddha's kind of describing how he went forth and then how he later attained enlightenment. So in that, there's the classical description, which is the same for anyone who recollects their past lives in detail. And this is just the description of how the Buddha says that they recollect back a very far time, and then it talks about how they see certain details of the lives and so on. So you can look at that passage. You can also find it specifically in Digha Nikaya number 2. It has it there, so that's one place to look. And other places where he talks about past lives,
I'd have to look it up. There's only a handful. He usually just mentions it just in general. He just kind of generally mentions that he can remember his past lives. There's only a handful of places where he goes into any detail.
Yeah. Actually, one just came to mind. Actually, there's one in the Anguttara Nikaya. It's one of the more interesting Jataka stories. And this is one, I forget the number, but if you look at the story, you can probably find it. It's about how he says that in the past, he was a wheel maker, actually like a wheel maker for chariots. And yeah, the king told him to make a chariot wheels in a certain number of time. And one, he took like a long time making it, and then he had only a little bit of time and rushed that one. And so you can, if you look at the story about like wheel maker or so on, that's in the Anguttara Nikaya, so that's an interesting one. And there are some others as well. So in the suttas at least that are mentioned, but yeah.
Yeah, I would just add though, so if you start reading the Jataka tales, most of the Jataka tales are apocryphal. Only a handful of them are actually from the suttas. So you can easily find these collections of Jataka tales. 95% of them are not from the suttas. So don't take them too seriously. Okay?
And Pedro says, to someone who is trying to stay in lay life while still believing in Buddhist values, how to generate motivation to complete lay life tasks while knowing it's useless?
Well, if something is genuinely useless, just don't do it. That seems to be the natural answer here, unless they mean something else besides the surface meaning of their statement.
Well, I think that they mean like they want to be a layperson, they don't want to be a monk, but Buddhism tells them that.
You can be a layperson without doing useless things.
Well, I think they mean like just general lay life, probably, the general activities of
what, like paying your bills?
I mean,
and that's actually useful, because if you don't pay your bills, then you don't have food and lodging and so on.
Well, maybe Pedro, if you're more specific, but I assume that what he means is like, why live a lay life at all, for example.
Yeah, I mean, you have to answer that question for yourself, because, I mean, for me, it just makes no sense at all. But thus it is.
I have an idea about this.
Go ahead.
I mean, I would say one thing you can do is generate motivation in terms of use your lay abilities to actually do really good deeds. So like, for example, as a Jayanta who's in the chat here, she gives donations and does different charitable operations. I mean, personally, I can't do that because I have zero money and also very limited resources. So as a layperson, you could actually motivate yourself by, for example, if you feel that, oh, why am I doing this job? Why am I living this lay life? Well, maybe you could work for a charity, or you could start a charity, or you could donate most of your income towards charitable operations that you find inspiring and that are wholesome. So that's also a way like to motivate. Like, why am I working, for example? You could work in order to do good deeds in the world. And if you want to be a layperson, that could motivate you to actually, not just to do it to indulge in useless, quote unquote, activities, but to do something really good.
Sadhu. Okay, and that's the last question. So I think we can go ahead and conclude at this point. So we'll finish the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.